In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the history of American corrections and also what the practical system looks like today. Much like with the history of policing and courts, some of the correctional history comes from Europe. Early correctional systems were based heavily on physical punishment. Fines, also sort of immediate punishment, is only in the last excuse me 200 or so years that we've really focused on incarceration as a major form of correctional punishment. Um, there are two major models for early American corrections. The first coming out of Pennsylvania, coming out of the system of government in place there, which was originally based on the Quaker religion, a very devout, strict religious sect. Um, as such, the prison looked a little differently than prisons in other areas that became more of the norm. The Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia was one of the first major metropolitan correctional institutions. Um, Later, then feeding in with Newgate Prison. Even the names were taken after some of the facilities that already existed in London, which makes it somewhat difficult when you're searching for these things online. You have to delineate if you're looking for the American version or the English version. So the way the Pennsylvania system was set up was basically everyone was kept in solitary confinement. They used this a building system called a panopticon, where you have one central guard that can look down various hallways and cells to see a vast majority of the people in the area. So you can have as few custodians as possible to as many prisoners. The prisoners were basically kept in their cell the entire time. They were there to think about their crimes. They were given a Bible to read. They had some small sort of crafting projects, but nothing really to entertain their minds other than the Bible, and they were there to repent. Um, the model that became more common across the United States and sort of developed as the country did is the New York system. Basically, it allowed the inmates to congregate in certain open areas, but they were then returned to their cells at night. So much like you would see in a modern prison, they were expected to be silent in their cells. This policy was adopted by other states. It does offer some benefits over the Pennsylvania model. The most notably is that solitary confinement is very detrimental to the human psyche, and being kept in that situation for years at a time is not going to have any sort of rehabilitative effect on the individual. Also, having them out of the cells allowed you to have prison labor. That made the necessity for creating the stripes, which identifies the inmates in case of escape. Also, by not having everyone in solitary confinement all the time, it allows you to use solitary confinement as a punishment. There were moves to increase the conditions in prisons, better the conditions there, reducing overcrowding, making sure they're properly staffed. And where they try to address this most notably is in what they were known as reformatories, looking at targeting inmates that were aged 16 to 30, trying to fix them, trying to give them opportunities to advance their position in society once they left the institution. They did that through academic and vocational training, something to go out into, which is it's common in prisons, not as common as it should be. There were a lot of pushes to reduce prisoners' access to things like Pell Grant, other federally funded tuition assistance programs, when really those are the people that should get them the most. The people that are the furthest from society have the most to gain by those benefits. Also, the issue with vocational training can be problematic. For instance, in New York, some of the prisons have programs that teach the inmates how to become barbers and hairstylists, which is a good trade. There's always going to be need for that, although I've sort of removed myself from that consideration. I've opted for quarantine haircut number 2. Quarantine haircut number 1 is to not get a haircut, and then you start having the waves down the back. Um, anyway, so they teach them in the correctional institutions to become barbers. The only problem is, in New York State, you cannot obtain a barber's license with a felony record. Okay, so they're basically setting them up for failure. But that wasn't the case when you didn't have as many litigious laws like that in the past. So they would train them, and then they would have a job waiting for, or maybe not a job waiting for them, but they would have a skill set to be able to get a job once they left the institution. They also created a parole system here, where the inmates would come in at a particular level and they would have to move up if they wanted to be paroled. And if they acted poorly in the middle level, they would move down and then have to move back up through the system to get parole. Which again, the goal is just to give them reasons and opportunities to behave well in the facilities. In recent times, there has been an increase in the use of prison labor, different types of it. Sometimes the inmates will go and perform a service. Sometimes for that service, they'll bring their own tools and equipment. Sometimes that'll be provided for them. Sometimes they go to factories to staff factories. Sometimes the factories are inside the correctional facility. Sometimes they make products that are then sold by the correctional system itself. Sometimes it's for a third party. Sometimes the products are used internally. In Georgia, they have a prison farm where they grow a lot of the produce that is then used in feeding the prisoners across the state. Another aspect of modern prisons has been the privatization of prisons, which has been nothing short of a shit show. There's another colorful term I'll give you the initials for. It's called a CF. If you've been in the military or you have family members in the military, you might know what that means. If you don't, you can look it up online. The effect of prison privatization has been an attempt by state governments to save money. What that has looked like in practice is underfunding of healthcare, underfunding of security, underfunding of food. And as you'll see in the video linked this week about prisons, a lot of those things are very clearly highlighted. Another type of incarceration that we have is sort of known as shock incarceration. Takes the form of boot camps. They are typically implemented for younger offenders with shorter criminal records. Instead of going to jail or prison, putting them in a non-correctional setting. Oftentimes they're out sort of in the country, away from society. And in theory, and while the individuals are at the facilities, they can see some good gains. The problem is, once they leave the facilities, it doesn't work. You're putting these individuals in a very regimented system where every minute of their day is accounted for, and then they throw them back into the same shitty neighborhoods that they came from, and they go back to the same patterns. One of the major reasons why that happens is because you're putting them in this militaristic model. When they complete the program, they still have felony records, and then they can't enter the military. So you're, again, setting them up for failure, much the same way that they train people to be barbers, knowing that they're going to be systematically prevented from obtaining a barber's license in the state where they live. So they're good publicity. Former governor of Georgia, Zell Miller, was a big fan of this. The Rock even did a HBO documentary series about how great boot camps were. But they're not. They cause more problems. They have lower success rates than even incarceration. It's just not, the whole thing doesn't look as good as it does when the kids are there at the facilities, because they still have to go away from the facilities at some point. So what the federal system looks like, sort of the practical system of corrections, much like everything else, we have a federal system and a local system. It's run by the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, which is a part of the Justice Department. That was created The Bureau of Prisons was created in 1930, but the federal prison system under the Justice Department was created in 1891. The first institutions were opened in 1905 in Atlanta and Leavenworth. The Leavenworth facility serves also as the military prison for the United States. The Atlanta facility is still there. The penitentiary, it's rumored that the walls go 40 feet high and 40 feet underneath the ground. The first women's facility was opened about 20 years later. And then the actual Bureau of Prisons was formed in 1930, again, as the need for a increased bureaucratic structure was required. Types of federal facilities, the top is U.S. penitentiaries. It's the maximum security facilities, what we have here in Atlanta. We also have a prison camp in Atlanta. If you can pull it up on Google Maps and look at the satellite view, the prison is here and the federal camp is over here. And the reason that they have those things, the reason that some people get sent to lockdown 23 hours a day and some people get to go to the places where they have tennis courts, is their threat level. If you are not a threat to escape, then they're going to put you in the minimum security because it's cheapest. That's where Martha Stewart went, okay? Because she's not going to escape. So that's the main thing. Is what is your threat level to the system? That's going to dictate what type of facility you go to. They also have correctional institutions, which are just sort of like maybe medium security facilities, not quite as strong as the penitentiaries. They have metropolitan correctional centers where they have to house a lot of inmates awaiting trial. In Atlanta, the federal inmates are held at the Garnett Street City Jail. Typically, if the area doesn't have a metropolitan correctional center to house federal inmates awaiting trial, they'll be held at a county facility in that area. In the past, they had been held at Rice Street in Atlanta, but because that facility has been under federal investigation for the past 20 years, they have to be held at the Garnett Center. They also have medical centers, and then I said the prison camps for the minimum security. And then you also have the detention centers, which are varying degrees of temporary depending on their need, but they are used to house a lot of people quickly. So prisons are correctional institutions maintained by the federal and state governments for the confinement of convicted felons. Okay, only for convicted felons. Now we're going to look at jails. Jails are run by local governments for those awaiting trial for federal local charges or convicted offenders sentenced to short sentences, so misdemeanors, sentences of less than a year. There are over 3,500 local jails across the country. And one of the major issues present with jails is getting out of them on bail or bond. Because if you can't get out, then you have to wait, and it could be months, or in the case of like Atlanta, some other major metropolitan areas, it could be a year or 2 years between the point when you're arrested and when you actually go to trial. And if you are innocent, that's tough. The types of prisons that we have at the local level, again, similar to the federal level: supermax, then maximum security, medium security, minimum security, and then open institutions or camps. Again, it just depends on what your threat level is. In Georgia, everyone that's sentenced to prison goes for 6 months to Jackson Diagnostic Facility in Jackson, Georgia, about an hour south of the city. And there they do threat assessments, psychological evaluations, medical evaluations, and pending the outcomes of that, plus your behavior reports and things like that while you're at the facility, that dictates what type of facility you go to. Okay, so that's the breakdown of the state and federal system. The next PowerPoint that we're going to look at next week is going to look at the daily operations of prisons, prison life, and some of the more nuanced aspects of the prison environment.